Alright, so it looks like everything is actually wired up. Now we do obviously have a pretty impressive looking rat's nest here, but whenever we do put down the PDB, or put the flight controller down and press it in, a lot of these wires are going to get hidden, and then by the time we tuck everything inside of here, we should be good to go. So before we actually start doing that, there's a couple of things that we want to do. First and foremost, we want to go ahead and put some heat shrink over our X4R here. We don't want this guy just kind of floating around like spaghetti in the wind. Looks like this is a little bit too long. We'll trim this down. Okay, so we're going to get some heat shrink on this guy, and I really, again, I love this clear heat shrink because it's going to let us see that the thing is in bind mode. And it's also quite large and shrinks down. I got this at Fry's, so this is going to be great for this application. Alright, so it looks fantastic. So I'm probably going to put this in fast forward mode and go ahead and configure and get everything tucked in here. Basically, you just want to tuck everything underneath the PDB, or in between the PDB and the flight controller that you can. We'll look at our hardware here before we get going. Once again, we have these little red spacers here. They're unthreaded. These go between your PDB and your flight controller. If you find that everything doesn't fit with this little guy, you can always use a little bit longer spacers. The more space you put in there, the taller the build that you have. Just bear that in mind. So try to use what is provided, but in the past I've used a little bit different pieces here. So we'll see how this goes, and I'll go ahead and fast forward this and we'll check in when it's done. Alright, so now everything is actually tucked inside in between the flight controller and the power distribution board. I did add a nylon nut there to add a little bit more space there. I think they're about 2.5 millimeters, just so that nothing was really being pressed down together too hard, and there was ample space for all these wires to breathe, and that does hide everything quite well. 2.5 millimeters isn't really going to affect you that much unless you're really trying to keep this as low rider of a build as you want, or as you can, but if that's the case, you're probably not using my 3D printed mount in the first place. So that being said, everything does kind of just fall into place from this point. We have our X4R. I go ahead and twist the wires up here so that it eats up that extra length, and then I set it front to back. And then the first thing we need to do here is power on our quad and actually bind it to our Tyrannus. So let's go ahead and do that before we move forward. Okay, so to do this, you go to your Falcon 130 profile if you're making a new one or whatever. We're just going to use the Atom just because I haven't changed the name of this. This is actually what I bind my other Falcon to. Okay, so now we're going to hold down our power, or our bind button on the X4R. I think I need to pull it out of here to do so. Okay, so we'll hold down our bind button. And power up the quad. Not the best of connections. You see there's a red and a green, which means that it's in bind mode. Then your Tyrannus, you go over to menu, page over, scroll down until we get to the bind, hit bind. You hear that little cheep chirp. I do believe that that means that everything is bound. Yes, so now we have a green light on our X4R, a little bit blinding with these purple ones here. We have a green light there, which means that it's bound and everything is good to go. So, power down everything. We'll finish wrapping all of this up. So, again, you're going to twist your X4R and lay it down front to back. This puts your antennas and the bind button towards the back, which is convenient because we're going to lay our Hawkeye on this towards the front. Now there's a cutout here in the top plate of the Falcon designed for the Hawkeye's dip switches to have access to them. So then we have our 3D printed mount here, and I've started threading a screw here. Depending on what hardware that the Falcon ships with, I know that LASD has been packing new hardware in to accommodate these mounts that we've designed together. But for these I had to go digging through my little hardware stash there and find something else. So you're going to want to make sure that everything is threaded in before you get going. Just get your screw started a little bit and sort of get everything, you know, loosely plopped into place. Turn this on here and start screwing it down. Now if you're using my 3D print, it does add 2.5 millimeters to the front, which is designed to be the exact same thickness as one of these nylon nuts. So you just need to put a nylon nut underneath or on top of these back standoffs here to accommodate for that. You can see the gap right there. You need to put a nut right there. And again, you're really not adding any weight with these things. They're just tiny, tiny little things. Alright, so it's starting to come together really well. We're going to go ahead and remove the our antenna here, and we'll get this pigtail mounted. Alright, so now we've got our pigtail mounted. We'll be able to throw an antenna right on the back there. I'm actually going to undo the screw and route the wires from the piezo buzzer into the frame so I can actually set this guy in there and then get it zip tied in so it'll be nice and out of the way. Alright, so now everything is packed in nice and tight. We just need to go ahead and zip tie this buzzer down so it doesn't go flying out on us, and then we need to set up our antennas. So now the way that I like to do my antennas is sort of make some bunny ears using zip ties and heat shrink. The zip ties form sort of a structure on which you can heat shrink your antennas to, and then they wind up very nice and secure. And you have to break a zip tie before the antenna is going to go anywhere, and it keeps it out of your props, which is very nice. So you just wind up putting a zip tie on here just like that. And mind you, we are going to trim these down. You only need to have exposed as much as exposed on the actual antenna itself. This little clear lighter portion, all of this in the black shielding you can actually hide inside of the body of the frame. You can go ahead and trim it down, but the downside to that is that if you nick off the end of your antenna, you're working with less and less. Some people will just trim them down to length, and you can buy them in like 10 packs, and then you just replace it whenever you need to. That's fine. Just make sure that you do caliper out this distance here, the length of the exposed wire, and make sure that whenever you trim your antennas that you re-expose that much from the shielding, because that's actually calibrated to our frequencies. So then I'll kind of loop this guy back around on itself once or twice here and tuck it back into the frame. So we're down in that slide slot there. I'm actually going to go ahead and get this antenna on here before we do so. So as you can see, the length of one of these guys, these little pieces of heat shrink that I have, actually comes out to be pretty perfect. So you tuck the antenna into there, and then you heat shrink it on. Actually want to go ahead and trim this down to length, so just cut it right where the heat shrink ends. And there you go. Now you've got a nice little bunny ear, you can see, with your antenna in there. And then we just need to, like I was doing a moment ago, finish tucking the excess antenna down into the frame. And then we'll get this secured in some means. Usually I end up winding everything together as best I can inside of the frame, and then I just run one zip tie to sort of hold all of that loose wire in there in place so that nothing comes out during flight and gets chopped up by the props. There you go. So now you just have like a little bundle of antenna down here, and like I said, we'll run a zip tie around everything to make sure that it all stays in there nice and securely. Let's go ahead and do the exact same thing on the other side. We'll probably speed this up. And then now we need to just run a zip tie around basically everything on the inside of the frame to keep the receiver, your buzzer, your antennas, and your video transmitter all secure, because those are kind of just pressure fit into there at the moment. Let's go ahead and run that. And generally this is a situation that calls for 2 zip ties being wound up together. So you use 2 small ones or 1 large one. I always wind up using 2 smaller ones. The more of the antenna that you can catch, the better. We made those little loops in the antenna, if you can see it there. And if I can manage, there we go. I got the zip tie to run right through that loop, and that works out perfectly. So go ahead and cap that with this zip tie here. And we'll run this one through that gap between the flight controller and our X4R. And again, try to grab everything that you can. Looks like I got it. So we'll tighten this guy down. Tighten this guy down. Obviously don't crank them, but you do want to make sure that they are holding everything that they're supposed to hold inside of the frame. Alright, and now we have a Falcon 130 here. We do need to put on an antenna, obviously, before we power it up or anything of that nature. And then we're going to need to put some props on. I think I have some Rotor-X props here. We'll go ahead and slap these guys on. We are going to use these Rotor-X 3040Ts, the RX 3040T props. These are basically the cream of the crop for your 3-inch class. SciFPV has a really good video series that goes over all of the 3-inch class propellers. And some of the different motor sizes and battery sizes and whatnot. But for these, on these motors, we do need to add these adapters that it comes with, and it's going to slide right over the motor shaft, and then you slide your prop down over that, and then tighten on your nuts. So go ahead and get these other 3 on here. Nice, we have our propellers on. And we will go ahead and check our all-up weight. So we're about 160 without a battery for the all-up for the quad, and 227, or about 230 grams. Yeah, 229, 230 grams there for the entire weight of the quad. So we did make it underneath the 250 gram limit. That's kind of a novelty. You don't need to register with the FAA, but I think mostly it's this new Outlaw class that people are making 3-inch sub 250 gram races, which is just kind of fun, and you know, they're just sort of something of a novelty. So definitely hit that weight. This is a 3S quad because we are using the 4100 kV 1306 motors. Yeah, so everything is good to go. We'll go ahead and configure this in Betaflight. I'm not going to do the Betaflight configuration as a walkthrough, because that's just constantly changing, whereas the hardware is basically you wire it up the same no matter what you're doing. So we'll go ahead and configure everything and get it ready to go, and meet up outside, and we'll go ahead and hover test this and give it a maiden.